Every neighborhood has its secrets. Sometimes they hide behind closed doors, dusty windows, or silent gazes. But at the end of that forgotten street in the city of East Haven, there was something different. Something that couldn't be explained with whispers and stories told in the dark. Old Harold's house was the kind of place that made even adults cross to the other side of the sidewalk. They say no one ever saw Harold leave. Its lights flickered without pattern, its walls were covered in vines, and there was a constant sour smell in the air around the property. Some children swore they heard muffled screams coming from the basement at night, but no one took it seriously. Until a group of teenagers decided to quell their curiosity, and that's when everything started to get out of hand. What was supposed to be just an innocent nighttime prank turned into the kind of story no one wants to tell. But someone has to tell it. And you might want to leave the light on after hearing this, because not everything that's locked up is really locked up. There were 4 of them, Jack, the oldest and a bit arrogant. Then came Tyler, his best friend, who was more fearful. Kimberly and Mia. They grew up together in that neighborhood. Since they were little, they had walked past old Harold's house with a mixture of fascination and shivering. Mia used to ask if he was a murderer or a wizard. Jack said he was just a crazy old man. But none of them knew for sure, and that was what made it all the more intriguing. That week, Jack came up with an idea. Let's go into old Harold's basement, just to see what's in there. I bet he keeps treasures or I don't know, bodies. The others laughed, but something in his tone suggested he was serious. And when the sun set that Friday, they made the pact that would change their lives forever. On Saturday morning, Jack showed up at Tyler's house with a backpack full of flashlights, a screwdriver, ropes, and even an old camera. "If we're going in, I want to record everything," he said with a smile that bordered on madness. Tyler hesitated, but as usual, he eventually agreed. Kimberly and Mia were harder to convince. "This is trespassing, Jack," Kimberly said, frowning. "What if he's really dangerous?" But Jack's answer was simple. That's what makes it more fun. As night fell, the group gathered near the house's rusty fence. The gate was ajar, as if it had been waiting for them. None of the 4 said much. There was a tension in the air, heavy, as if even the wind was trying to warn them to turn back. But it was too late. Jack led the way with his flashlight on, his steps light and silent. Kimberly followed close behind, muttering that this was all a bad idea, while Mia clung to Tyler's arm, trembling despite her feigned courage. They crossed the yard covered in dry leaves, dodging pieces of broken furniture and old tools. When they reached the back door, Jack used the screwdriver to pry open the lock. It was as if it had never been locked in the first place. The door creaked open with an agonizing sound, revealing a darkness that seemed alive. And then, without looking back, they went inside. From that moment on, there was no turning back. On Saturday morning, Jack showed up at Tyler's house with a backpack full of flashlights, a screwdriver, ropes, and even an old-fashioned camera. "If we're going to go in, I want to record everything," he said with a smile that bordered on madness. Tyler hesitated, but as usual, he eventually agreed. Kimberly and Mia were harder to convince. "This is trespassing, Jack," Kimberly said, frowning. "What if he's really dangerous?" But Jack's answer was simple. That's what makes it more fun. As night fell, the group gathered near the house's rusty fence. The gate was ajar, as if it had been waiting for them. None of the 4 of them said much. There was a tension in the air, heavy, as if even the wind was trying to warn them that they had better turn back. But it was too late. Jack led the way with his flashlight on, his footsteps light and silent. Kimberly followed close behind, muttering that this was all a bad idea, while Mia clung to Tyler's arm, trembling despite her feigned courage. They crossed the leaf-strewn yard, dodging broken pieces of furniture and old tools. When they reached the back door, Jack used the screwdriver to pry open the lock. It was as if it had never been locked in the first place. The door creaked with an agonizing sound as it opened, revealing a darkness that seemed alive. And then, without looking back, they stepped inside. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The flashlight's light trembled in Jack's hands as he approached the steel door. Who put something like that in a basement? Tyler muttered, more to himself than to the others. Kimberly studied the locks with watchful eyes, trying to figure out if it was old or new, and strangely, it seemed to be both. Mia, standing a few steps behind, felt a pressure in her chest that she could barely explain. It was as if that door was breathing, alive. Jack turned the first latch with effort, making a metallic sound that echoed through the basement like a muffled scream. The second one opened more easily. At the third, everyone looked at each other. It was as if an invisible decision had been made between them. If this last one opens, no one will be able to pretend that everything is okay anymore. And yet he turned it. A sharp click that cut through the silence. The door was unlocked. For a moment, no one moved. Not even the sound of his own footsteps echoed anymore. It was Jack who reached out to push the door. But before he could touch it, it opened by itself. Slowly, as if something on the other side had been waiting patiently for that moment. A cold breath came from inside the hidden room, bringing with it a smell of rot and something else. Something sweet and putrid like meat left out in the sun. The four of them backed away instinctively. And then, inside, something moved. The room behind the door was small, with padded walls like those of a psychiatric cell. In the center, a cage. And inside it, a being. It wasn't human. Or rather, there was something human about it, but it was all distorted. Its skin was pale, almost transparent, as if it hadn't seen light in years. Its eyes, huge and bulging, stared at the teenagers with a mixture of pain, anger, and intelligence. It was chained, but something about the creature suggested that the chains were there more out of habit than necessity. Kimberly took a step forward, mesmerized. "Oh my God, is this real?" Tyler pulled her back, his face pale. "We have to get out of here. Now." Jack, however, couldn't take his eyes off the thing in the cage. He approached slowly, ignoring his friend's calls. That was when the creature spoke. Yes, it spoke. In a hoarse, guttural but clear voice. "You shouldn't have come." That broke the last of Mia's courage, who let out a muffled scream and backed away until she hit the shelves at the back, knocking over jars and ancient tools. The sound made the creature stir. The chains jingled, its eyes glowed a vivid red for a second. "He'll wake up now," the creature whispered. "You called him." Jack backed away, finally understanding what everyone had felt from the beginning. That cage wasn't for him. It was to stop something worse from coming for him. But now it was too late. Something began to shudder in the ceiling, as if the house itself was waking up, or answering a call that had been dormant for a long time. The entire house began to shake as if it were alive, breathing along with the caged being. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the dry crack of wood cracking echoed through the basement. Kimberly grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her toward the stairs, but the step they had used to descend was now covered in a thick, black slime, pulsing like living flesh. It was as if the house didn't want to let them out. As if it were absorbing everything around it. Tyler turned to the creature in the cage, his voice cracking. Who's going to wake up? Who is he?" The answer was a sad, almost human smile. "Harold isn't the owner of the house. He's the jailer. He was assigned to keep him locked up, and now, without the locks, there's no stopping what's coming." Jack tried desperately to re-engage the locks, but the pieces no longer fit. The steel door was warping as if it were melting from the inside out. And behind her, a sound, a beating. Slow. Like a giant heart waking up. On the wall next to the cage, they noticed symbols scratched with a knife. They looked like runes, or perhaps warnings in a forgotten language. Kimberly recognized them from a book her grandfather kept. "This is ancient. This is not human." The creature looked at her, serious, and added, "No. And now he will want you in his place." At that moment, one of the chains of the cage broke with a snap, and it was not the creature that moved, it was something behind it. The floor cracked beneath their feet, revealing a deep crevice that extended towards the heart of the house. From it rose a suffocating heat, accompanied by whispers, many whispers. You know when you are in a place so silent that you start to hear your own blood rushing in your ears? It was like that, except the whispers came from outside. From something that was rising. Jack fell to his knees, staring at the crevice. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaking. The answer came as a muffled roar from the depths, an ancient, hungry presence. The being in the cage screamed something in an impossible language as if trying to stop what was coming. But it was too late. From the center of the crevice, hands began to emerge, human hands but deformed, mixed with claws and burned skin. Mia screamed. Kimberly pulled Jack away hard. But he seemed hypnotized, his eyes glued to what was emerging from the hole. Tyler gripped the camera, trembling as if recording this was the only way to maintain his sanity. It was the only proof that hell was real, and he was waking up. From within the crack, a tall figure emerged, shrouded in shadows and twisted flesh. It had eyes like burning coals and a smile that extended beyond logic. It was him. The thing that Harold was trying to keep locked away. "You opened the door. Now someone needs to take my place," the creature whispered in a voice that seemed to come from inside each of their heads. Jack, without understanding why, took a step forward. And deep down, maybe, he already knew that the house would never let them all out. The being's presence was suffocating. With each step he took out of the crack, the air seemed thicker, heavier, as if it were sucking the hope from the teenager's lungs. Jack stood still, his eyes wide as if a part of him had already been ripped out. Kimberly screamed, begging him to come back, but it was as if he couldn't hear her anymore. Mia cried silently, clinging to Tyler, who was shaking uncontrollably. The caged creature tried to crawl towards them as if it wanted to stop the inevitable, but there was no strength left in its skeletal body. Suddenly, the being stopped. It looked directly at Jack and smiled. Not with its lips, with its eyes, with its skin, with its very presence. The house shook once more, and then everything went silent. The crack slowly closed, swallowing shadows and heat with it, and Jack disappeared. There was no blood, no scream, no sign. Only emptiness. The creature in the cage lowered its head, like someone regretting a cruel but necessary decision. He chose. Now the door can be sealed for another generation. Kimberly, in shock, could not accept it. Did he choose? He didn't choose anything. This is our fault. We shouldn't have come. But deep down, everyone knew. Jack had felt the presence from the beginning. Knocked on the door. Unlocked the seals. It had called to him. And somehow he had answered. The basement went silent again, as if nothing had happened, except for the caged being's eyes, which now watched them with a strange sadness and relief. Outside, the night seemed normal. The wind blew the leaves from the street, and old Harold, with his slow steps, walked toward the house. He found the back door open, and he descended the basement stairs with the caution of someone who already knows the nightmares stored there. He saw the chains, he saw the young people sitting on the floor, devastated, and he saw the cage intact. Was he chosen? He asked without emotion. The caged being nodded. Harold just closed his eyes and murmured, "Once again, thank you for holding the weight that no one else wants." Kimberly, Mia, and Tyler left the house that morning, swearing never to tell anyone what they had seen. But the truth was that something was following them. Not a curse, not a monster, but the memory, the feeling that something was still watching them. As if there was a part of them that was trapped in that basement along with Jack. The group fell apart over time. Each one went on with their lives, but none of them slept peacefully again. At night, when the wind blew strong, they all heard the same whispers. Years later, a new family moved into the neighborhood. Among the children was a curious boy named Brian, who loved to explore forgotten places. One day, he passed in front of Harold's old house, now empty, and saw a small door open in the back. Curious, he went in. Inside, he found a ladder to the basement. And with a naive smile, he started to go down. Because that's how these stories go on. The basement is still there, waiting. But wait, what you just heard is nothing compared to what's coming next. The story you're about to hear is even more disturbing and sinister. Stay tuned, because you're going to wish you'd never heard it. John Sullivan was an ordinary photographer, someone who spent most of his time capturing tranquil landscapes and everyday scenes. His passion for photography was fueled by the need to observe the world around him with meticulous attention, something that made him unique. He was not a photographer of celebrities or grand events, but rather someone who appreciated the simple beauty of small moments, like a golden sunrise or the shadows of trees at dusk. In his solitary routine, he became a master of observation, capturing the essence of things with a click of his camera. However, something changed when he moved to a new apartment. The view from his new home was of the building across the street, and the residents there seemed to live interesting but distant lives. John had never been interested in the lives of others, but his new window gave him a privileged view of everything that was happening in the building next door. He began to photograph what he saw, initially just to explore the possibility of a new series of photos. But as time went by, he began to notice strange details about the people who lived in that building. The first time something truly disturbing happened was on an ordinary afternoon, when he was observing his neighborhood through the lens of his camera. It was then that he saw something that changed everything. One of the residents of the building across the street, an ordinary-looking man, was doing something that no one should do. The scene he witnessed was shocking, and John immediately felt a sense of unease. For a moment, he wondered if he was just imagining things, but the certainty that what he had seen was real made him uneasy. That moment seemed simple, but something about it seemed wrong. What John saw that day was so unexpected that he hesitated to believe it. He was observing the building across the street as usual, when his gaze fixed on one of the apartments on the top floor. The window was ajar, and the sight he saw was clear. The man was involved in a scene that seemed inappropriate, something that could not be justified with words. John tried to turn the camera around, trying to distract himself, but the images he had captured were already in his mind, like an impending nightmare. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. He knew something was wrong, but he had no concrete proof. The photos he had taken could be interpreted in many ways, but the images were etched in his memory and he could not erase them. His mind was filled with doubts. Was this man just a monster, or was he just misinterpreting what he saw? John, uneasy, began to wonder what he should do with the photos. Should he tell someone? Show them to the police? Or should he just delete them and move on with his life? The feeling that he had seen something much deeper and more disturbing began to take hold of him. That night, as he looked through the photos on his camera, a strange feeling took hold of his chest. Something was wrong. Not only with the image he had captured, but with himself. He had the feeling that he was being watched by someone, even though he was alone in his apartment. John turned his head quickly, looking for any sign of movement across the street, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling lingered, as if the simple act of watching had made him a part of something bigger, something dark. He turned off the camera and forced himself to sleep, but he couldn't. Something kept him from relaxing, as if the scene had left an irreversible mark on him. For the next few days, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The images of what he had seen in the man's apartment began to haunt him, but there was something else, something much more disturbing. He began to notice strange shadows in the windows of the building across the street, even when he knew there shouldn't be anyone there. Sometimes he thought he saw a sudden movement or a figure watching him from right in his own apartment. But whenever he looked again, the window was empty. It made him wonder if he was really imagining things or if there was something more sinister going on. The obsession with the building next door grew unbearable. John found himself staring at the window of that apartment, waiting for the man to appear again. The feeling of being watched grew. He stopped going out for walks as usual and started staying inside the house, just looking at the other building through his camera. Every time he adjusted the lens, he felt a chill down his spine, as if he were being watched by someone inside. He began to wonder if the man in the window had noticed that he was taking pictures, if he knew that John was watching him, and worse, if he now knew who John was. Things got worse when John noticed that, increasingly, the other residents of the building across the street seemed to be acting strangely around him. He had never noticed them so much before, but now it all seemed like a big game of hide and seek, with him being the target. He felt there was a pattern to the neighbors' movements. Whenever he looked out a particular window, someone was there watching him. There was a tension in the air, a sense that he was being watched and that, somehow, he was at the center of something much bigger and much more dangerous than he could comprehend. Desperate to understand what was happening, John decided to take action. He knew that the obsession would not go away, so one rainy night, he grabbed his camera and climbed up to the roof of his building. From there, he had an even clearer view of the man's apartment from the window, and he felt that, finally, he would have the chance to find out the truth. Every move seemed to be carefully calculated. He pointed the camera towards the man's apartment, waiting for him to appear at the window again. For a moment, he thought this might be the end of his anguish, but he was soon surprised by something unexpected. Before he could adjust the lens, something in the windows of the building across the street caught his eye. In the window of one of the apartments on the lower floor, a figure materialized, standing still, staring straight at him. His heart raced. It wasn't the man he was looking for. It was a different figure, but the feeling of being watched returned with intensity. John froze, not knowing what to do. The figure remained motionless for several long seconds, until it finally moved away. It was enough to make John take a step back, fear tightening his throat. He knew something was happening. Something he couldn't understand, but that was becoming impossible to ignore. And it was at that moment, when he was almost determined to go down and face reality, that he saw something even more bizarre. When he looked back out the window of his apartment, he saw that his own window was reflected in the window of the building across the street. And in the reflection, he noticed a shadow moving quickly, as if someone were approaching him. Panic gripped him. He turned away from the window, looking into every corner of his apartment, but there was nothing. Nothing but the terrifying feeling that he was no longer alone. The feeling of terror took hold of John for the next few days. He could no longer distinguish between reality and paranoia. With every sound, every shadow, he found himself alert, looking for any sign of movement. He tried to run away from this feeling, but it seemed to follow him. The man in the window still haunted him, but now something stranger was happening. On all his daily walks, he encountered furtive glances from strangers on the streets. Something was very wrong. People seemed to know something that he did not. He felt like he was sinking into a nightmare from which he could not wake up. One night, after what seemed like an eternity of sleepless nights, John decided to confront his neighbors. He was determined to understand what was happening and expose the truth. He climbed the stairs of the neighboring building, knocking on the door of the apartment that he believed belonged to the man who had disturbed him so much. But when the door opened, John was met with an elderly woman. She looked at him with a blank expression, as if she already knew what he wanted. "You've already seen what you shouldn't have," she said in a hoarse voice. John stood there, shocked, uncomprehending. The woman stared at him with an enigmatic look, almost as if she were in possession of a secret he would never understand. As he tried to process what he had just heard, the woman invited him in, and that was when he realized that the truth was much more complex than he had imagined. The woman revealed that the man's window was not just a window, but a vantage point for something much larger. There was a network of people in the building, all involved in a dangerous game of surveillance, and John had become part of it without even knowing it. He was not only an observer but also a target. She warned him, "If you keep looking, you won't be just a spectator anymore. The next time you look out the window, it will be too late." Her words echoed in his mind as he walked out of the apartment, the weight of the discovery crushing him. After that conversation, John felt the weight of reality begin to set in. He was no longer just dealing with what he thought was a simple obsession. He was part of something much bigger. A shadowy network of people who hid behind the curtains of their windows, watching each other in a sinister plot that seemed to have no end. John no longer knew who to trust or where to hide. His every move seemed to be predicted before he even made it. He tried to ignore it. He wanted to live his life again, but every time he closed his eyes, the thought that he was being watched consumed him. In a last-ditch effort to make sense of it all, John picked up his camera once more and aimed it at the building across the street, determined to capture whatever was happening. He needed the truth, he needed to see it with his own eyes. But when he clicked, the light from the camera reflected off the window and he saw what he should never have seen: the faces of people he knew. They were there, in the window, looking right at him. The images of their faces began to blend together, and it was as if the people around him, his neighbors, friends, and even strangers, were all connected by an invisible line of surveillance. It was an impenetrable network. The last photo he took was the last thing he saw before he lost consciousness. A feeling of suffocation took over him and everything went black. When John woke up, he was no longer in the comfort of his apartment. He was in an unfamiliar place, and what frightened him the most was the absolute silence around him. There was no one around, but he knew something was approaching. From somewhere he heard a low, dark laugh. He tried to get up, but he couldn't. Fear paralyzed him, and the only sound he could hear was the rapid beating of his own heart. The last images in his mind were those of the faces in the windows. The feeling of being watched now seemed to be just the beginning of something much worse. The feeling of being watched never left him. John no longer knew who to trust or where he was. The darkness around him seemed to swallow him, as if he were trapped in an endless nightmare. Fear took over his body, and he didn't know if what was happening was real or if he had completely lost his mind. The laugh, still echoing in his mind, turned into a muffled scream that made him look around, hoping to see something, anything. But what he didn't know was that what was happening to him was just a part of a much larger deadly game. As he tried to find a way out, the images from the windows began to overlap his vision. He realized that he could not escape what was happening. The man in the window, the shadows, the strange figures, it was all part of something planned. The building in front was not just a place of observation, it was a control center. Each of the residents had a role to play in a psychological and physical game, a game where fear and paranoia were the main weapons. And John, without knowing it, had been drawn into this game, like a puppet unaware of what was behind his movements. In a last moment of lucidity, John saw that the truth was even more horrible than he had imagined. He was at the center of a secret network, where every move was watched and controlled. The last photo he had taken with his camera was not just an image, it was the key to something much bigger. It was the starting point of an endless cycle, where paranoia and manipulation intertwine until no one knows what is real anymore. As he looked at the camera, he realized that the images captured showed not only the building in front, but himself being watched from every corner, as if he were now part of the game, playing his own fate. What happened next, no one knows for sure. John disappeared without a trace. His camera was found, but the photos he took were corrupted, all empty, as if something or someone had erased all evidence of his journey. The residents of the building in front were never seen again, and the elderly woman he had met never appeared again. But the most frightening thing was that, weeks later, people began to report a strange feeling of being watched, as if a specter were hovering over the building. Around every corner, a shadow seemed to lurk, and even those who had never heard of John began to feel the same paranoia he had experienced. On his last night, before he disappeared, John had looked out the window one last time. And it was at that moment, as the light from the camera reflected off the windows, that he finally understood: the game would never end. He wasn't the only one being watched, and he would never be free of his own scars. Now, the people around him were part of something much bigger, a continuous cycle of observation, fear, and manipulation. John, like the others, would become another piece in the puzzle of a never-ending plot, where the line between the observer and the observed disappears. And so, John's story doesn't end here but goes on, like a shadow that never fades. If you found this story terrifying, don't miss the next video. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming.